Welcome to this session on Equitable Assessment in Action, Case Studies and Implementation. My name is Gavin Henning, and I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm a professor of higher education at New England College. And I'll let my co-presenters introduce themselves.
And hello, my name is Natasha Jankowski. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director for the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, housed at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.
And hello, I'm Lundquist. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Campus Strategy at Campus Labs. I use she, her pronouns. And at Campus Labs, I work with assessment practices with multiple universities across the United States and the world.
Hello, everyone. I'm Erick Montenegro. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the Communications Coordinator and Research Analyst for the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. I'm also a doctoral candidate at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign.
Well, thanks for joining us. And these are the takeaways we hope you'll have after watching our session and engaging and hopefully thinking a little bit about some of these topics. So we'll be able to examine conversations as they're unfolding about equity and assessment. They're not happening just here, but all over the place. This conference is a great example of the theme about equity and assessment. Describe some current efforts and what it looks like to do equitable assessment at the institutional level and other levels. And then identify the plethora of resources available so you can learn more about this and also get involved. I'll pass it over to Anne to get us started with an overview.
Great, thanks. Gavin and I started a conversation about this between ourselves several years ago. And then I know that Erick and Natasha had been writing about culturally responsive assessment, and that kind of sparked, I think, our interactions with one another around the topic. And so one of the things that we realized, and Gavin and I come strictly from assessment backgrounds ourselves, and so what really happened is we started to think about how the scholarship in the field, the people who practice, the examples and the paradigms and the ways that we approach our work, particularly in the higher ed environment, that the worlds of assessment and the worlds of diversity, equity, and inclusion were very separate, and the people doing the work. So, we began to talk about what that would look like when those worlds begin to come together. And one of the things that has emerged out of this is, for those of us who are assessment folk, which many of the folks on this webinar probably are, we're pretty used to that typical traditional assessment cycle where we think about, I'm going to identify my outcomes, I'm going to think about what method I use, deliver my programs and services, figure out how I'm going to collect my assessment data, collect it, analyze it, interpret it, use and share the results. We're pretty familiar with that cycle, and at least I know for me, I tended to think about that in a pretty objective way, that I would approach that work as if it were my responsibility to accomplish all of that, and I didn't really have a lens towards the larger issues that might be at play. So if we position the assessment conversation in a context of societal culture, the institutional context and culture that where we might work, where we're conducting the assessment practices. And then if we even more so position that in terms of like our own positionality and our power and privilege and agency for the folks doing the assessment, but also the stakeholders that are going to use the assessment results, the student participants or other folks that are going to be participating in the assessment data collection process, we really begin to see that there's a lot of other factors in the assessment cycle that we need to take into consideration. And if we do that well, then hopefully we're going to make an impact, not just on institutional effectiveness, but on the larger conversation around student learning and potentially really on society as a whole in terms of social justice. So then sort of the last thing that to kind of position this conversation where we're going to get down to some practical examples here. Gavin and I sort of, as we began talking about this and presenting on it and writing about it, there's a lot of different language out there. I know Erick and Natasha's first paper was on culturally responsive assessment. We've talked about, not having bias in assessment. There's the assessment for social justice, there's decolonization. And we really started to think about those things as not necessarily being equal to each other. While there's no common terminology, there's really sort of a continuum. So way on the far end of the continuum, there's where our assessment practices are actually causing harm. So the way that we select the methods or what we omit or what we choose to do or not do, actually beyond just the sort of institutional review board and ethics of our profession where we think about not causing harm to participants, it can be greater than that. We can actually be inflicting harm, particularly for marginalized populations in the way we do our work. And then as we move forward, as we grow our understanding and we begin to engage in some of these practices that we're going to talk about in this webinar, we begin to understand and view and see bias where it might be and see how we can unpack that and potentially eliminate or reduce that. And we can move into a space where we're more culturally responsive in the way that we do it, and actually move towards unpacking systems of power and oppression for socially just or deconstructed assessment, and really moving to an advocacy role that assessment can play, a transformative role that assessment can play in actually dismantling things that are unequitable in a way that actually leads to transformational and systemic change. So that's sort of the theoretical continuum that we see. And I think a lot of the practices that are emerging, they take place in various spaces around here, and we're starting to think about various ways that people are approaching this large topic of equity-minded assessment. So I'll turn it over to Natasha, I think, or Erick.
Thank you. So keeping this in mind, what does equity-minded assessment actually entail? What is it all about? And here we have 6 tenets that we think offer a pretty good picture of what this equity-minded approach to assessment is. And the first one is that we really do have to continuously check our biases, right? As Anne mentioned, that's kind of the first step we have to move into in this direction. And one way we do this is by asking reflective questions throughout the assessment process, really. And, you know, we like to think about assessment as being objective and kind of being apart from the subjectivities of life and society. But we're all human, and we have to address our assumptions and our positions of privilege that we kind of bring to the assessment process, right? And so we have to continuously check our biases and our assumptions. And second, we have to utilize multiple sources of evidence, which is good assessment practice, right? It's been heralded in the literature as using multiple sources being good assessment practice. But we also have to go a little further than that and make sure that these sources of evidence are appropriate for both the students being assessed and the focus of the assessment effort, right? And one way that we can ensure that our assessments are appropriate for the students that we serve is by including students' perspectives throughout the assessment process. We need to have students more actively involved in assessment, which is ultimately a process that will impact their own learning, right? But it's not enough to just listen to students, right? It's not enough to just have their voices at the table. We also have to take action based on what they share with us. The fourth point here takes that a little further. On top of taking action, we also have to increase our transparency in the assessment results, yes, but also in the actions that we take, right? This involves not only sharing our data online and making it accessible to different stakeholders, but it also requires that we provide context and supporting information of why these data matter for different stakeholders. One element of transparency is making our processes and our results available. The other part is making sure that stakeholders understand why these matter to them, right? So using language that allows for stakeholders, students, prospective students, faculty, fellow staff, and administrators to really understand what we're saying with our assessment data and what impacts it's having. And speaking of data, we need to also ensure that the data we collect can be meaningfully disaggregated and interrogated. So what do we mean by this? Well, oftentimes we fall into kind of the pitfalls of looking at data by analyzing kind of white students compared to students of color, low SES compared to non-low SES, or males compared to female students. But we don't often go deeper than that, right? So we need to analyze the intersection of these characteristics and ask why those inequities exist. And finally, equity-minded assessment requires that we close the loop, right? Again, with the good assessment practice. And we also need to make evidence-based changes that address issues of equity that are context-specific. So inequities arise differently across institutions, departments, and programs. So we have to address the inequities that matter to us, right? To our students in our context. We can hope to address all inequities, but that kind of would be exhausting, would be too much work to have one assessment effort address everything across the board, right? So we have to really hone in on what matters to us, what matters to the assessment effort, and what matters to our students. But this doesn't mean that we only use assessment results to address inequities. Of course not, right? But we should be intentional in using assessment to remedy inequities that exist within our context, to use those findings, close the loop, and improve not just our learning and our teaching, but also some of the equity gaps that we see. And then in LOA, we often talk about equity-minded assessment from the perspective of cultural responsiveness. It builds upon the 6 elements discussed in the previous slides, while also bringing an intentional focus on being mindful of the student populations being served and involving those students in the process of assessing learning, right? So what we talked about before, including students intentionally in the process. And culturally responsive assessment also uses appropriate student-focused and cultural language in learning outcome statements to ensure students understand what's expected of them. The reason for this is that often learning outcome statements are written by faculty in language that makes sense for other faculty or administrators, right? But it doesn't always relate to students. So we need to take that intentional step forward to make sure that students are actually understanding what is expected of them, what we hope that they do as a result of a learning experience, as a class, as a co-curricular experience. The third point here is that cultural responsive assessment should develop and should use assessment tools and multiple sources of evidence that are culturally responsive to current students. And this involves using examples that are inclusive, allowing students to better engage with content and attain the desired learning outcomes, and really approaches that the assessment process from an asset-based perspective can really bring out and hone in on students' capabilities, right? We want to make sure that we approach this from a perspective that really allows us to see that all students are capable, all students contribute to the learning in the classroom and the co-curricular experience, and wherever that learning happens. The focus isn't on the demonstration, but on the learning itself. And finally, culturally responsive assessment is critical of structures, demonstrations of learning, and supports which may privilege some students' learning while marginalizing others, right? Again, this involves reflecting on how our practices and norms are built out of assumptions we may carry, what type of experiences and demonstrations of learning we take as appropriate, and how that impacts different students. And it's also about taking stock of who our students are, who we actually have in the classrooms, who we're going to have in the future, and what that means for our practice, right? So that can all contribute to a more inclusive process, and we can really improve teaching and learning for all students. So at its core, equitable assessment calls for those who lead and participate in assessment activities to pay attention and be conscious of how assessment can either feed into cycles that perpetuate inequities or can serve to be more equity or bring more equity into higher education, right? And on the next slide, we have 2 more resources that if you're interested in learning more about equity-minded assessment, socially just assessment, cultural responsiveness in assessment, and so on, you can dive into. The first one is an AALHE occasional paper released earlier this year, which really takes a look into the evolution of the equity and assessment conversation over the last 3 years and charts a path forward into what equity-minded assessment is, how the field of higher education can embrace and sustain those practices to really meet the challenges of the new decade, right, with the changing student enrollments. And the second resource is a special issue of New Directions for Institutional Research, which came out in 2018, I believe, and it's titled Assessment and Social Justice, Pushing Through the Paradox. And it contains approximately 8 or 9 really useful articles spanning different topics, all related to equitable assessment practices and perspectives. So I really encourage you to check that out. And I think Anne also has a couple of resources from Campus Labs to share as well.
I do. I know in addition to NILOA's webpage, we sort of cross-fertilize with some of our information, but we have a webpage dedicated to socially just assessment. And on it is some very brief findings of an outreach we did mostly to student affairs practitioners and assessment folks in terms of what they were doing in their own practices. We also recorded a podcast series, and Gavin and I facilitate that. Natasha and Erick were on one of those, and multiple other people that we spoke with. And then there's 3 webinars that are going a little deeper than we are today onto some of the background around this practices and sort of the theoretical and paradigms and foundations that maybe lead to the why we choose to do or why we're unconscious about some of the choices that we make. So if you want to be able to dive into that, that's some good resources. You can just go to that web link that's on the slide here. And then I think we're going to kind of transition into some more practical examples. But you know, we're sort of seeing how the fields with what Erick and Gavin and all of us are talking about here are sort of beginning to come together. So some of the principles, the terminology, the language, the practices. And one of those things is there's a lot of reframing, at least from my point of view. I'm thinking about reframing how I think about things. So thinking of assessment as inquiry, so curiosity, not knowing and wanting to find out with sort of an open-minded perspective that doesn't impose my own hypothesis on the situation. And then equity, beyond diversity and understanding, the population of our students that we're serving, or whether or not we have a welcoming campus environment, inclusion practices. Those are all important practices, but beyond that is actual equity. So how are our students being served, and how in particular are marginalized student populations learning, growing, developing, and having access to resources on our campus in that context-specific way that Erick mentioned. So I think the fields are starting to come together, and we want to share some of the ways that we see that happening with you today.
So I'll go ahead and share some of the case study examples, and thank you everyone for the wonderful setup to that. It's so refreshing to think about the types of conversations that are unfolding within the scholarship on assessment that are inherently not compliance oriented, but embedded in teaching and learning and students, and really thinking about positioning assessment as a change maker. And so I'm delighted to be sharing some examples. So the case studies that I want to share, there's 5 that I want to talk about of what does this look like on the ground, and what are people doing with it, came from a partnership with the CAS, the Council for the Advancement of Standards, and Campus Labs and NALOA, who put out a call to say, hey, if you're doing this stuff, we'd love to know about it, because it hasn't really been a conversation space. And we got a lot of really great responses and examples, and then some people were feeling like we're trying, but we need a little more time. But I think they provide interesting perspectives on the different parts of the assessment cycle, and how people are thinking about where to place equity in that, but also how to communicate what they're doing, and ways to understand who their students are, so they can support and serve their learning. So the first one I want to share is from Capella. Capella University is an online for-profit that's headquartered in Minnesota. It's known for their transparency and results. If you aren't familiar, you should look at their website, capellaresults.com, which is a whole website designed just on results. So if you want to see how someone's doing website transparency, I think it's a great example. They have about 38,000 students in 53 degree programs, and the average age of students is 39. So they're sort of give you a little bit of contextual information. A lot of the work that Capella is doing on transparency in relation to equity aligns really well with the principles of adult education and how we're thinking about that space. So when we did these cases, we asked each institution to sort of share what equitable assessment practice means to them as they're thinking about it. So for Capella, it was that learners that are going through their courses and learning experiences have an equal and unbiased opportunity to demonstrate what they actually know and can do in every phase of the assessment process. And for them, that meant being very clear in what's being assessed, how it's being assessed, and how students can meet those expectations. Because of that focus on transparency and that clarity to students and faculty, and everyone's on the same page on what is going to be required and how that aligns to something else, it really also positioned an opportunity to say, if this is where we're going, there could be multiple demonstrations to get there. And so you can have that conversation on how can I best as a student demonstrate that I can meet this learning and attain that learning outcome in that particular manner. Part of that same transparency conversation is through how they visualize where you are in your learning journey. And so as an online provider, they have a lot of cool tools, one of which is the competency map. And in the competency map, which I'll give you just a quick little snapshot of what that looks like, it shows you, this is the student-facing view, where you are in your movement towards those things, how to contact someone to talk about it, and what the opportunities are for you in relation to that diversity of thinking about your demonstrations of learning. So that concept of there shouldn't be any guesswork in how to navigate for success, that our students should be on equal footing for their ability to be successful and achieve. That's really where Capella is thinking about the role of assessment in supporting equity for their students and making it about their students and their learning. So that's one, thinking about that transparency role. And we think about that transparency role, Portland State University takes that, okay, how do we deal with multiple demonstrations and think about that for our learning to take it to the next level. So if you're not familiar with Portland, it's a public research university. It's got about 26,000 students. It was founded in 1946, and they do have a history of institutional portfolios. So like there used to be an example for accreditation on how would you visually do your portfolio online as an institution to talk about your work. But it's neat. It's just these are my random tidbits of example things about these institutions. So when we asked Portland what equitable assessment really meant to them, it was about participation in the process. So really thinking about that involvement in ways that are meaningful to our students and our faculty. So also we were talking about the role of students in this, but if faculty feel that they don't have the flexibility to show demonstrations, then that can be a problem, or think differently about how to allow their students to share their demonstrations. So for that, it's multiple pieces of evidence of learning that students can curate. So I'm in charge of thinking about how my learning fits together, and then thinking about how does that work across the student groups to look at those multiple intersecting identities. So to Erick's point about it's not just disaggregation, but disaggregation with intersections, that's a good example of that. They also took on adoption of principles of universal design, thinking that's just good for everyone if we think about how universal design fits in to this concept. And also, how do we have e-portfolios curate this diversity of demonstrations to help students really think through that, and then that data disaggregation of subgroups. That's Portland. When we think about methods that you can try differently, Cornell University was a nice example of an alternative approach to thinking about engaging in stakeholder voice inclusion. So they used ripple effect mapping, but Cornell University is a private land grant. Interesting historical information. If you're a higher ed student, you should check out how that works at school. In New York, founded in 1865, and it's got about 24,000 students that attend. But ripple effect mapping is actually a process of how you get groups together to engage in multiple stakeholder voices of the impact of things that moves through organizations in a different way. So it's a mechanism by which you hear other opinions, think about that complex change of reactions. So by engaging in ripple effect mapping, they were able to think about stakeholder voices differently, and also figure out about impacts that we don't see from where we sit. So that's, I think, a really nice way to think, well, what's our methods that we can get to some of these principles? All right, two more I want to share. Wake Forest University is a private university in North Carolina, founded in 1834. It's got about 8,000 students. Their motto is "For Humanity." That is a solid motto, and one that we need today. Let's just leave that there. One of the things that's really nice about the Wake Forest example and what they shared about their work is they were thinking about what is our organizational structure? Who's responsible for looking at these issues and to ensure that equity is a part of our assessment conversations? And how are we dealing with the wide-scale professional development coupled with an awareness campaign to get folks to be a part of this? Because to Anne's point earlier, you cannot go on a lone equity quest within an institution and expect to see change. This is inherently a collaborative process. So Wake Forest actually engaged their campus life assessment committee and got into conversations like, let's read the theory, let's read about practice, to raise our staff awareness and get those conversations going so that it's not odd to have a conversation about, well, let's ask equity questions in this space. And that assessment committee has an equity and research subcommittee who is charged with advancing equity mind assessment. So their job is to raise those questions and think about that and share research and advocacy in that area. Coupled with that, in terms of the ongoing research projects that they put forward and opportunities to ask those questions, they do data dives where it's bringing folks together to say, let's really get into this so that we actually understand who our students are, not what we think they are on the surface or who we were as students, and read into the data that way, but really think about what questions do we ask when we disaggregate data, because it's less about engaging with the data to find an answer and more about engaging with the data to find our future projects that we need to put our attention on to advance our students. So I think that's a nice way to think about how can we use our existing structures to start to move into equity conversations in that space. Last one I want to share with you is Capella University, which is a private research university in Ohio. It's got about 3,300 students in 60 majors, founded by the Lutheran Church in 1830. Different relations with that now. But the approach that they went through is, how do we look at our existing processes, practices, and research methods and modify them to think about problem solving differently? So they applied critical race theory as a framework to any of the practices around assessment that were coming out. So if you had a question that you wanted to answer, we're going to use critical race theory as a lens to address those questions and experiences. And they wanted to know, what are the actual experiences of students of color? What's really going on with that? And do students feel comfortable to have those conversations with us? Are they having different experiences? What are students' perceptions of diversity and inclusion? Are those different by race? And they tried each of the different elements. So they did a method of permanence of racism and counter storytelling and critique of liberalism and interest conversion as individual methods that they applied then within their assessment process. So being incredibly clear in how this is directing what they're doing as a research project, basically, within the institution. So I hope that those give you some different examples and ideas of ways that institutions are starting to think about and engage in this work around assessment. What that allowed us to do as a group was kind of say, well, this gives us some questions for reflection. If you're familiar with any of us, you know that we're more like, what does this make us think about in our group? So of course, we want to offer a few questions that you can consider as you reflect on your own practice. And think about ways to get started. How do you want to get moving into this work within your own institution and your context? And so some of those are, it was pretty clear when we asked the responses, we're like, what does equity-minded assessment mean to you? And if your institution is unsure, if you're not really having a shared definition, if stakeholders are going, I don't know why you're asking me to be a part of this, maybe starting with that shared definition of equity-minded assessment, and do we have one? And what does that mean to us might be a great entree point into getting into these conversations. The language one was another one, and Erick had mentioned this earlier in some of the tenets of this work, but is the language that's used regarding learning outcomes assessment understandable to various stakeholder groups, including students? And so thinking about how are we not able to partner with those who can be allies in this work and really incredibly useful just because we speak differently and potentially in ways that we don't have to. We have a ton of acronyms. We should probably leave the acronyms to the side when we sit down at a table to have these conversations and engage in that. So thinking about language and how can we use language differently. Also process questions. So that was very clear in some of these examples are, what are the processes for critical data disaggregation? Do we even have that kind of data to be able to look at intersections, or do we not track it? And we don't have a way to think about that, or we don't have shared data definitions to go. And so this might be a place where institutional research is a friend that you should take out for coffee virtually for now, but then later together and maybe split a scone or something like that. But once you understand how to do that data segregation, what are the processes and places where different communities can express their needs and voice concerns? And are those heard? And what happens? Do we adapt policies and processes accordingly? Or do we say, thank you very much for telling us that, we're still going to do this over here? And so the idea of sharing voice becomes different. So thinking about, like the ripple effect mapping method is, how do we ensure that people are there, we're hearing that voice, and we're actually hearing what's being said and not going through to mark off that stakeholders have been involved. And lastly, what assumptions do we have at play? What are those assumptions in our structures about how our students learn, where they learn, how they can or cannot demonstrate that learning? And thinking about really examining that from an equity lens would be crucial. So hopefully those can give you a few. I would not tackle all of these at once. Pick one and think about it, or ask with a friend, but it at least gives a starting place in that regard. So I'd like to turn to Gavin to lead us in some reflections and invitations.
Yeah, so now we want to be able to give an opportunity to you to really think through how can you get involved on your campus, or how you can get involved in the conversation at a national level. So first of all, think about your own practices, and are there some things you want to share? NILO, CAST, and Campus Labs are still accepting equity case studies, so there may be something you want to share. put it out there, or share it just on an assessment listserv. People are always looking for concrete examples, and that's an easy way just to put it out there. And if you put that out there, I'm sure that will start another conversation that'll be helpful for others. Write a response to the papers that are out there right now. That's actually how Ann and I got our start. We responded to the Natasha and Erick's original paper, and that got us thinking through this on our own. And just by the act of writing, had us thinking a lot and then raising a lot of questions. Simply talk to other people. Talk with colleagues on your campus. Talk with colleagues who are doing this work. Look up any of the authors that are writing anything about this. Reach out to them. My experience is they will all be willing to talk with you about the work that they're doing or about their thoughts around that. And then ask others within the institution what they may be doing, or how they want to get involved. Would they be interested in moving forward, or you're thinking about what this looks like on your campus, in your department, in your division. And really just get involved by making a difference. And making a difference starts with yourself. So think about your positionality, your biases, all those things that you bring to that. Ann and I talk a lot about this because, being identifying as white and me being a heterosexual cisgender man, I have a lot of privilege and power. And I have to really be considerate of that because I'm not challenged in that privilege and that power in society. So I've got to challenge myself so I don't bring those biases into all these conversations and into the work that I do so I don't cause harm, because we certainly don't want to do that. So those are just a few ways that you can join the conversation. As I mentioned, I would please check out the NILO website. There's a whole section of the webpage just dedicated to equity. There's some great information on the Campus Labs website as well. And as we wrap up, I want to invite our panelists to see if they have any final parting words they'd like to share with folks viewing today. Let's start with Natasha.
I would say if this work is picking up a lot of steam, I think. When the paper came out, the conversation is moving, the scholarship and the literature is moving, but where we are nationally, it is incredibly poignant, more so now than before. And so while I appreciate that our scholarship and our dialogue is going and examples are emerging, this needs to be an embedded part of our daily practice. And especially as assessment professionals, listening to the AALHE conference things, thinking about the fall in light of COVID and our students who are limited in ways that they can or cannot participate in how we're asking them to demonstrate learning. The conversations that we're having today become incredibly actionable and real for our students to ensure that we aren't, for the sake of consistency in data, shutting down the ability of students to be an active part in their own education. So I am delighted that we were able to do this. I think the conversations from the case studies are excellent, and I appreciate the amount of conversation across the conference as a whole on this topic, because we have a great opportunity to Gavin and Ann's points so far, to not cause harm at a time when doing so, it's never good to cause harm, but doing so now could be increasingly worse. So proceed with confidence and do the right thing, but also know that this work needs to move at the speed of light and get moving. And the time is now, and you've got a wonderful mechanism as an assessment professional to leverage this conversation at your institution if you had not been able to before. So I would use that and use it wisely, but you got this, you'll be good.
And
yeah, I'm going to pick up on what Natasha was saying there. I really think the same thing. As a former assessment director myself, I know that assessment can be still viewed in our campus as like this afterthought thing, this onerous thing, this bureaucratic tedium that nobody wants to do. And when you come into the room, they're like, oh my gosh, she's going to come talk about data with me, and I don't want to have it. But what I'm finding, especially in the work that I do at Campus Labs, where I'm having conversations all day long with different campuses, is that student success and equity are top of mind in also a way that they haven't been top of mind before too. And assessment and data and all the myriad ways that we can do that, if we can expand our thinking, are the ways that we know what's working, what's not working. And if we are ourselves open to checking our own biases, expanding our worldview, and getting engaged with multiple stakeholders in the conversation, we are going to be able to actually make a difference in ways, I think, that are going to transform higher education. And so as opposed to assessment being this afterthought extra irrelevant thing because of what's going on in our culture. It's actually one of the imperatives. Equity is not an afterthought either. So bringing those two conversations together about inquiry and equity, I think it's never been more important. So I'm excited to see all the work that's coming out.
Erick?
Yeah, I agree with what Natasha and Anne both shared, but I think also something that I also stress when I talk about this work is that professional development is key, right? We're asking assessment professionals, faculty, staff administrators to talk about assessment in ways that they probably haven't approached it before. And if you're talking about equity, that requires that you often talk about race and racism, power and oppression, right? And as we see today in what's going on in society, those are conversations that need to be had and can't be avoided, right? It's easy to avoid things that make you uncomfortable, things that you're afraid that maybe you're not going to approach in the right way. You're going to kind of put your foot in your mouth. But in that same breath, I think that's where professional development comes into play, right? To equip folks to have these conversations, to open up spaces where, you know, you can put your foot in your mouth and you won't be judged for it. You can learn from it, use it as a growing and learning experience. So I think professional development, and it ties into what Gavin said earlier about finding those people on campus that kind of share this drive, right? That you can kind of lean on, because this work is taxing. Talking about equity is not something you can just step in and out of. It's not something you can do when it's convenient or when it's easy. Estela Ben Simon and Dr. Tia Brown McNair talk about, you got to walk the equity walk, talk the equity talk, right? You need to live it. You can't just use it and then step away from it, come back in. So I think that can be taxing. So finding those coalitions, those partners, or people that are like-minded in your institution or in your community are extremely powerful. And I think conferences like this that open up the floor for folks to kind of meet and network and talk about this thing can be a good point to, even if it's just a question, like Gavin said, right? Pose a question, start thinking about it, start ruminating and start to work one step at a time. But yeah, the professional development piece, I think that is huge in equipping folks to work through this and make it sustainable.
The only other piece I would add is that this can feel really overwhelming for folks. People who are new to assessment, that assessment in itself is really overwhelming. People like myself who are in positions of power and have never had to think about their identity, this can be really overwhelming. And as Erick mentioned, people are scared of making the wrong decision or making the mistake. But I think a little is better than nothing. Ask that one question. How is my identity impacting my assessment? When I create a survey, are all response options available? Are they exclusive? Whose voices are not being included? That's all you really have to do to start. It doesn't have to be massive. It doesn't have to be big. There certainly are opportunities for that, but what small changes can have huge impact. Well, thank you very much for enjoying and listening. Feel free to share this with other colleagues. Continue to do the work on your campus, and please check the resources on NILO and Campus Labs, because we all will continue to add those things. So there's more and more resources for folks out there. Thank you very much. I want to thank Natasha, Anne, and Erick for their great thoughts. Have a wonderful day.